Hi there. Now it's time to start painting something. And I need to paint the hull, especially this part where the cross beams are located, so that I can see that everything fits together. And I also need to fit the cross beams in order to proceed with the next step in the build, and that is to make the side beams that are located roughly here, that will keep the trampoline in place. So let's do some painting. Before I can paint with good result, I need the sand. Especially the edge is rough. I want to remove the excess glass threads without removing much else. For a number of reasons, I will use an epoxy paint. A two-component paint can get much harder and tougher than other paints can. Epoxy is water sealing, and with an UV additive it will also be stable in sunlight. To retain the same color, it's important to stir the color carrying component before mixing. To harden to the optimal strength, it's important to mix in an exact ratio. Thus I weight the components. I start with a small batch, 80 grams of component A. To save paint and to keep the outside clean, I wipe down the paint back into the canister and wipe clean the outside. I need 20 grams of component B to get a 4:1 ratio. Mixing is also essential for a good result. I start around the towers to make sure that I can proceed with the build, even if I run out of paint. This paint floats out very nicely on flat surfaces, but painting on vertical sides I need to do it in 2 steps. As the epoxy is hardening slowly over a couple of hours, I will have to revisit the vertical sides to take care of running paint. Having painted the area around the towers, I still have paint left. So I continue with the aft deck and the middle deck. Having filled the surface with paint, I flatten out the surface with long strokes. This is to avoid bad cover where the brush stroke starts or ends. I also continue with the front deck. To avoid the trouble with running paint, I keep to the surface that is mostly horizontal. When I have ended this batch, I will let this cure before I turn the hull 90 degrees. Mix a new batch of paint. Now I can paint the area that is mostly horizontal in this position until I reach the end. Then I take care of running paint and soften out the transformation zone. Still I get areas where the paint has run. I flip the hull as the paint on the deck should be rather hard now. As it's most important that the bottom is flat, I remove dust just before I start painting this. Here I use a sticky cloth to remove any dust. Then I start painting. This area will be most difficult to paint as there is a constant curvature. That means that the paint will run. I saturate the surface with paint as I move aft, keeping to the areas that are more horizontal than vertical. Then I move forward again, flattening out runnings. I will need to revisit the sloping areas during curing. Now I strike the area from down to up to transport excess paint back up again, as I don't want a too thin paint layer high up, but still want to avoid running. I finish with a thin coat on this totally vertical area. After about an hour I'm back striking out paint runnings. There is a balance between micro unevenness from restriking and paint running. After about 4 hours I turn the hull again. I want to paint wet in wet, or at least wet in less than 24-hour hard paint, as this will give me a chemical bond between the paintings. After about 24 hours you cannot get new paint to grip on the surface, and I would have to sand with a coarse sandpaper to get the paint to hold on. Thus I hurry on this side, prioritizing the transformation zones. For the moment I'm happy with the flow of the paint. On these vertical surfaces I will have to paint in 2 layers. That is 2 thin layers with about 2 hours curing in between. In the meantime I finish this side and use up the last of this batch on the area behind the centerboard. After a couple of hours I have mixed another batch of paint and can finish the area and continue on another side of the cross beams. I focus on the endings as I need these to be of the finished size and paint inwards as far as the batch lasts. If I have at least the connection sides fully painted, I can work on the attachments and finish the beams holding the trampoline. I turn the beams when the paint is cured and do not run any longer. As the beams are mostly flat, I can paint one side at a time and get a good result. On the vertical end sides I will paint with 2 thin layers. The finish of these areas are not so critical. I use up the rest of the batch and finish with a sharp edge for the future. After about 4 hours I'm back putting on the second layer on the vertical sides and painting the next side. I take care of other areas that are also horizontal now, before I finish off this batch. Now I have painted all connecting sides, on the cross beams and the holders. Thus I can finish the trampoline beams without having to wait for a new batch of paint to arrive. I may not work on the catamaran project in the next episode, as I have a sailing adventure in the pipeline. If I get an approval from the authorities, there will be sailing instead. Anyhow, I hope to see you back again next week.